Okay, we are live. Hi, everybody here. We've got a pretty small group here today, but we've got some people on the live chat, including my mom, and hopefully Bethany can join from California. So today we're talking about Iran's subsidy reform plan, which started in 2010, and basically what they did was they had a bunch of oil subsidies to make oil cheaper, and they wanted to cut those subsidies. And what they decided to do, unlike what happened in France, which we talked about last week, is they decided to use that extra money and pay it out as a direct cash transfer to pretty much everyone in their country. So very, very similar to a basic income. And we listened to an episode of the Basic Income podcast with Jim Pugh and Owen Poindexter, and they interview Dr. Djavad Salehi-Isfahani, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I don't know that I am. But he's a researcher, and he studied the program in Iran, and he's got some really interesting things to say about it. So I guess I'll ask you guys if you have any initial thoughts about Iran and their program, and then we'll get into listening to some clips from the podcast.
Yeah, I listened to the podcast. They didn't find any bad effects about it. So it's a good thing, I think.
Okay.
Well, they're making it universal was a good step, but there's still a lot of bias against it because the upper classes, they want a servant class, and they don't want. They think like this in the podcast that they were. They think that you have to be starving to want to work or something like that.
Right. Yeah, they were worried that if you gave people money, they would stop working, which is something we hear a lot when we're thinking about basic income and talking about basic income. So yeah, let's get into the podcast. So I've got my tabs here, and we'll play the first segment.
I should begin by saying that it was set up as a compensation for a very large increase in energy prices in December of 2010. The Iranian government sells the bulk of energy to its citizens because Iran is an oil-rich country, and it has kept prices constant for a long time. So as a result, to bring them to international levels, it had to increase prices by factors of 2 to 9, so very large increases. And in order to make that possible, basically to prevent social unrest as a result of such a big jolt to the incomes of the poor, it decided to implement a cash transfer program alongside.
Okay. So this is interesting because, last week we talked about something very similar in France where they were increasing fuel prices, petroleum prices.
20%.
Yeah. And we saw a ton of unrest in France as a result of that and the whole Yellow Vest movement. Whereas here, they increased prices by a much greater factor, 2 to 9 times.
But the prices were originally 30 cents, so that doesn't really...
Right. But still, if you're used to paying a certain price and someone increases it a lot, I think it's understandable that they were worried about unrest in this kind of situation. Hey, Nick. Yeah, and they gave people money, and the program was widely unpopular. But did you have the kind of unrest that we see in France? I don't think so. Do you have any initial thoughts about Iran, Nick?
I think people should talk about it much more. I mean, it's the only experience of that scale that I've heard of.
Yeah.
And it's sort of just happened and it was huge. And I guess it's still going on at some level, though it's not universal anymore.
Yeah, so since the Rouhani government came into power, they've changed it somewhat. They've increased the payments to the poor and decreased the payments to the not poor, partly. And there have also been issues with inflation, and then we could ask questions, well, where's that inflation coming from? And there were sanctions as well, like we talked about with Venezuela, so that can obviously be a factor. And a lot of this is really hard to untangle. So the fact that they replaced oil subsidies with the cash transfers, that suggests to me, there's kind of an equivalence there that people make, like, oh, well, we were getting this thing and now we're getting this other thing. So that's kind of one way to kind of justify it morally, at least, that it's something that's okay to do.
It's a Robin Hood thing, taking from the rich, giving to poor.
Yeah, to the extent that the rich are benefiting more from the oil subsidies, which they could have been, they probably were, then you are having that kind of an effect. Yeah, but then the question is, and this is a difficult question to answer, the question is, did reducing the oil subsidies, did allowing the price of oil to increase, did that actually allow the cash transfers to be possible? Like, was there some causal relationship there, other than like the moral kind of equivalence of we used to get this and now we're getting this? So my mom's on the live stream. She's asking, what's the difference between subsidies and cash transfers? So subsidies basically mean that the government is paying for part of the oil. So if you get fuel or any kind of petroleum product or anything like that, you're going to pay a cheaper price than you ordinarily would. A cash transfer means you're getting cash and you can spend it on whatever you want. And the cash transfers go to the individual people, whereas the oil subsidies are kind of like a discount when you buy the oil. So it's only affecting people who buy oil or petroleum products, and it's affecting the people who buy more of that stuff more. So the people who are able to buy a lot of oil get more of a benefit because they're able to buy more, and that's how the subsidy goes. Whereas the cash transfer is just, at least the way they set it up, was equal to everyone. So even if you weren't buying a lot of oil, you would get the benefit, and you didn't have this, incentive to use more oil because oil happens to be the thing that's cheap or something like that. Yeah. Yeah. We can move on. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say one part of the story that I found, I think was missing from the account in the podcast, has to do with, or I don't know, he emphasized that there wasn't a lot of support for it from the elites, partly because the Ahmadinejad's base was the
more conservative, rural, religious.
Right.
Yeah.
And that those are the two sides of, the commentator said that Iran's pretty polarized politically, and kind of identified those two sides of the front. And, but it seems like the change that happened after the change of the leadership of the government was actually to sort of skew it even more, right? To reduce the payments to the richer,
right,
and increase the payments to the lower income or the
yeah.
poor. I mean, I guess I don't know how they define that, but it seems like that seemed kind of like mismatch in the story, and I mean, it seems like it would only make it less popular.
Yeah, if it's unpopular because it's going to all these poor people and you don't want them to be lazy, and then the change is that you give more money to poor people and less to everyone else, then yeah, that's not really a consistent story for what the problem is. And I think a lot of it had to do with that the people didn't like Ahmadinejad, right? So when the more liberal guy came into power, they were kind of against his policies, partly because it was from him. And I don't know. I mean, were people upset about it? Yeah, I mean, maybe the reasons they said they were upset about it changed. So now when you've got the more left-leaning regime in power, then they kind of want to give more money to the poor. Whereas, prior to that, when it first came into effect, maybe they were, or maybe it changed over time. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Say $90 for everyone.
Yeah. So yeah, it was. I guess
started off at 45 and then went to 90 after it went to just the poor. I think that's how.
Yeah. So I think it was the same for everyone, and everyone in the country was eligible. You had to register for it. So not everyone got it, but that's just because some people didn't register for it.
They didn't believe it. It was very funny.
Right. Yeah. So some people didn't believe that the government was going to be able to.
That was the first. 70% registered for it, and then afterwards it was 95%. I think it was.
Yeah. So it was very close to basic income. Yeah.
Was $90. Was it a good money for that time for Iran?
I mean, it was. I think it made a substantial impact on people's lives. Yeah. So in the podcast, and maybe we'll get to this later. I think it's in one of my clips. They talk about how some people's total income was $45 per month. So if they got another $45, that doubles their income. So that's a very, very significant impact for a lot of people. And they talked about the reduction in poverty, the poverty rate in Iran from something like 12% down to 4%. As a result of this. So yeah, it was a significant amount. And $45 there, so obviously they're being paid out in rials. So you're calculating the $45 based on the exchange rate between the rial and the dollar, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the local purchasing power either. So a dollar goes a lot further if you're in Iran than it does if you're here. So even though they were getting $45 is more money to them. Than it would be to us.
In the podcast, I didn't hear anything about for how long they gave that money to people.
6 years, I think.
6 years?
Yeah, so they started to phase it out in 2016 and shifted into this more targeted program that looked more like a conditional cash transfer, something similar to more similar to a welfare program that we think of. Yeah.
Experiment for a long time for 70 million people.
Yeah. I mean, that's what Nick was saying, and it's mind blowing because people in the basic income community don't talk about this a lot, but there are a lot of similarities, and there's a lot of data that exists from those years that we could potentially learn a lot more from. And I think the guy who's talking on this podcast is just scratching the surface in terms of what the macroeconomic effects are and stuff like that. So it would be an interesting project for someone to go deeper into this.
One way I was trying to wrap my mind around the understanding the magnitude of the payment for people was that in the podcast I think he mentioned that that if you were correct for purchasing power, it was about $100 a month.
Right.
And I guess I was just inspired by the fact that he commented that it was about 10% of GDP.
In terms of the total payout, yeah.
Yeah. And since GDP per capita, I was just looking up that since GDP per capita is about 3 times here as it is there, maybe that would be comparable to having a basic income payment of $300 a month.
Oh.
Here. If you kind of scale it proportional to GDP. I don't know how much sense that makes, but I mean,
I think it makes some sense. I think it's always tricky with different countries and different currencies, and depending on which goods you're talking about, the prices might be the same in America as they are in Iran. Like if you're trying to buy something off, I don't know if you probably can't buy things on Amazon from Iran, but there's commodities that are traded on global markets. Like we talk about oil. If they weren't subsidizing it, it would be just dollar for dollar, same price here and there. But then it's like if you go to get a haircut, that's probably going to be a lot cheaper. So it can be difficult to make a direct comparison because the relative prices of everything in their economy is different. In terms of the prices of the things we care about the most, it's probably food, housing, healthcare, that kind of stuff. So I don't know.
Right. I guess looking at it as a fraction of GDP is more, or scaling it the same way as GDP per capita, is more relevant in the discussion of, well, where does the money come from? How are you going to pay for this?
Yeah, it is. And then,
or maybe the question of the demand side, like, is it going to cause inflation?
Right.
Is there capacity to produce that much more stuff?
Yeah, I like that you brought up that point because GDP is not the same thing as potential GDP. So maybe your GDP is lower because you're deciding not to sell more oil than a certain amount, or people don't have the money to buy certain things, so you're just not producing them, and there's sanctions, so it's hard for you to export, and that kind of thing. So maybe your GDP becomes higher if there's more demand, or if people's purchasing power is distributed more evenly, so that you've everyone's a customer now instead of just the people who aren't poor and that kind of thing. So lots of interesting questions there. And it's hard to know what the productive capacity of an economy is. With a place like Iran, I don't know the details of what the sanctions are. I know there's a lot of stuff they can't import and export, but there's certainly some stuff they can, and not everyone has sanctions against them. So that would be interesting to look into more closely too. Yeah. Let's get to another clip. So here's the second one.
And so simultaneously, when they increased energy prices, they deposited cash in people's bank accounts, about 70 million.
That's just a continuation of the last one. Here we go.
At the beginning, then Iranian President Ahmadinejad wanted to give it to the poor. They couldn't identify the poor. They tried running surveys, getting households to fill in questionnaires, but they found out that wasn't a very accurate way of finding out people's income and wealth. So in the last minute, basically, they said, okay, we're going to give it to everybody.
So that's interesting. Yeah. They couldn't identify the poor. So that raises a few questions for me. If they couldn't identify the poor back then, how are they identifying the poor now? Did they develop some infrastructure that allows them to do that better, and that's how the Rouhani government is able to send money to the poor? Or is it that maybe they're still bad at identifying the poor, and some of the poor people are falling through the cracks now because it's hard to identify them? Another question that it raises is, if it's really hard to identify the poor, does that mean it's also really hard to identify the rich? And how much do income taxes make sense if you can't really, if you have a hard time identifying what people's incomes are in the first place? So those are kind of the thoughts I had from that. But it's also interesting that this was an accident, that it wasn't intended to work this way, and then they just realized, oh, well, we can't really figure out how to do it. So the pragmatic thing was just to anyone who registered got the payout. You got something?
That I find that part of the story really surprising. They were like, you know what, we can't do a good enough job of deciding who to give this to, so we're just going to give it to them.
Yeah, and the fact that they admitted that, right?
Yeah, to me that speaks really well of that.
Yeah, that they looked at it and they said, oh, this is not really doable.
Made that decision.
Yeah, so my mom says easier to identify the rich, probably the poor don't pay taxes, but then the question is, do the rich pay taxes? Like, like maybe there's a law that says the rich have to pay taxes, but if you pretend not to be rich, then can you get away with not paying them? Or can you set up your accounts in such a way that technically you don't have to pay them or something like that? So I don't think that just. I mean, I think it is easier to track down the rich because you can look at money trails and follow money, and there's fewer of them, and that kind of thing. But it's not trivial. And hypothetically, you could say, okay, we're going to identify who all the rich people are using these various processes, and then just say everyone who we haven't identified through this process is poor. So as long as you're not on this list of rich people, you can collect the payment. But I think that probably wasn't worth it for them to go through that process. Yeah. Yeah. So it ended up going to everyone, and the intent of it was, well, for one, to get oil prices back up to the market price. I'm not convinced that was necessarily the best thing to do. I don't know what kind of pressures they were seeing that forced them to do that, but they felt it was necessary at the time. It wasn't a question of let's figure out how to give money to people and, oh, there are these oil subsidies over here, we can remove them. It was more a question of these oil subsidies are unsustainable. What can we do about it? And I'm not quite sure why they became unsustainable at that point. I don't know if people were, arbitraging oil, like buying it in Iran and then selling it outside at market price, and that kind of thing, or what was going on. And I don't know. Another question is, what is the supply of oil? Like, how much oil do they have? How much oil can they produce in a certain period of time? Is it some fixed amount and they're always maxed out, and it's just a matter of figuring out how much of it to export and how much of it to sell to their people and how to price it and that kind of thing? Or is it that they really have, like we hear about Saudi Arabia, and they really have like so much, they could be, producing so much more, exporting so much more oil than they are, and they choose not to because they want to keep prices within a certain range and that kind of thing. So I don't know if it's similar in Iran. So that's a question, and that affects, the answer to that question would affect, why this is all happening and why they felt the need to remove the subsidies and all of that. Because hypothetically, if you've got unlimited supply of oil or virtually unlimited, like you're not constrained by it right now, you could hypothetically keep paying out oil subsidies to your people and pay a basic income. So it's hard to say. I don't know. So Superman is on the chat, and he says universal basic income is the best idea. Does Canada have anyone running against Trudeau that supports for UBI? I have no idea. That's an interesting question. Let us know if
actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
Trudeau wants to create a basic income in Canada or run a pilot or something like that, but he doesn't want to continue the Ontario pilot, which doesn't make any sort of sense. He wants to spread it, but he doesn't want to continue the thing that's already happening.
Is it that he doesn't want to continue the Ontario experiment, or is it that Doug Ford wanted to cancel it?
Doug Ford wanted to cancel it, but he could just continue it, but he doesn't want to overrule the states or the provinces or something. Right, I guess. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not really a contradiction. It's that he's respecting the state to make its own decisions, but he would still like to have a basic income pilot in Canada. If Canada has a candidate for UBI, it would be his first time voting. So Superman, I would look into Justin Trudeau and see what he says about basic income. Because if Richard is right and he wants to, run a trial experiment or something like that, maybe Trudeau is the person to stick with. But I don't really know that much about Canadian politics or who's involved there. Yeah. So yeah, what were we talking about?
John has another question actually.
Yeah.
How do we make estimates of
How do we make estimates of poor people in the country? I think that's tricky, and I think this is a road that basic income advocates always or often try to go down, and figuring out what it means to be poor and how to decide. Or actually, basic income advocates don't necessarily go down this road that much because they want to give it to everyone. But for other social programs, it's you can have different standards for who's poor. It can be based on income, and you can say, well, people below this certain income level are poor, that kind of stuff. In the United States, that's how we make estimates. We have a poverty line, and we say, well, everyone below this line is poor, or maybe depending on what policies you're involved with, you might say anyone below twice the poverty line is poor, that kind of thing. Homelessness, I think, is a little bit easier. Well, it's not necessarily easier, but we can estimate all these things. Homelessness is a more discrete thing. If you don't have a house, you're homeless. Whereas income is more of a continuous variable where, it would be really arbitrary to draw a line between who's poor and who's not. It's not as hard to draw a line between who's homeless and who's not, because you just ask them whether they have a home. And maybe there's some kind of in-between stuff where people are crashing on each other's couches, or staying in hotel rooms, or living in their car some of the time, or that kind of thing. But it is a more kind of a discrete characteristic. But we have. I think Iran probably doesn't have as much data as we do about the incomes of individual people. There's a lot more rural, like farmers and that type of thing. Yeah. Self-employed people. So mostly it's self-reporting on income tax, which is tricky because if you're trying to get benefits and you earned a lot of money the previous year, then there's always a lag there in terms of it's not whether you're poor now, it's whether you were poor last year. A lot of times that you get the benefits, and it's not quite that way. Like you can file for unemployment and apply for various things, but there's always a lag. So I think it's easier to tell who's poor and who's not if everyone's incomes kind of stay the same over like 10 years ago I was making exactly the same as I am now, and I fall in this bracket and I always will. Then it's a lot easier to classify people. And part of the reason I don't like classifying people in this way is that it creates, to be able to classify them, it creates an incentive to keep people at the same level that they are, because then it's easier to figure out who's poor and who's not and how poor people are. If there's more mobility and people are moving around and increasing their income or decreasing their income, then it gets really hard to classify people and really hard to decide who these programs go to. So that's why I would prefer not to even go down that road of trying to evaluate people in this way. Yeah.
I think it's also not possible to determine poor people by using tax returns, as John said. Because I don't know Iranian system, but I can imagine Middle Eastern system.
Yeah.
It's not like USA. In USA, people report their how much will they pay as tax.
Yeah.
But in there, without reporting, governments take it from everything directly, automatically. I mean, from salary, from products. So it's not easy to do that.
So you're saying it's harder because people try to avoid reporting?
There's probably more of a black market as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so this can,
registered economy
is only a small part of the economy.
I mean, I don't know, but I can.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think the answer to this question is different in a place like the United States as compared to a place like Iran. And I think it's harder in Iran. It's likely harder in Iran.
The punishments for not paying taxes, people really scared of it.
Oh, that's a good point too.
This is not the same in the...
Yeah, like if you don't pay your taxes here, the IRS is going to come after you, and that people might not have that same fear in other places. So yeah, and like I think it is easier here to get estimates of these kinds of things, but that doesn't mean it's easy. That doesn't mean that we can just say, okay, we're gonna do such and such for poor people. Like there's still a ton of bureaucracy involved, and like trying to figure out who qualifies for which programs, and it's not an easy thing. So you can just imagine how hard it is to manage all of these programs in the United States and how kind of ineffective we are. And then you can multiply that by some factor and imagine a country where it's even worse than that. And that might have been, what Ahmadinejad's regime was facing. And, they looked at it and said, we can't deal with this. Let's just have people register and keep it simple. Yeah. So Superman says, I find it's more for me being stuck in a job that you are only doing for a paycheck to make ends meet. I like UBI because it would at least give you the option to tell your boss to pound sand. I think it basic income can create some balance in the labor market. In an ideal world, we would think of the labor market, and we would think of wages as being something that incentivize people to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily be doing. We wouldn't necessarily think of it as if you don't have a job, you are not able to survive well or something like that. So in a world like that, if there's a terrible job, maybe you'll do it, but it has to pay enough, and that gets I don't know. I think that's an easier society to live in, and I think it's more efficient for allocating labor as well. Because if you're a company and you're offering horrible jobs that no one wants, then you're not going to be able to do that anymore. You got to find ways to either pay people a lot or make the job more appealing, or something. It's going to be in your best interest to make the job more appealing to the worker. So I think the basic income can help align the incentives of employers with what's good for the people who they're trying to get work, or trying to get to work for them. Yeah. And I think this is to kind of bring it back around to Iran too. I think if you have some level of basic income in your economy, then it makes it easier for your local economy to have the demand that to really kind of reach more of your potential in terms of production for people, because now people have the money to spend. And I'd be interested to see more of the macroeconomic data from Iran, like maybe how productive they were, how much stuff people were buying, what were the consumer spending patterns before and after they implemented this program. Like that's the stuff that's really interesting to me. They kind of focus in this podcast on whether people are still going to work afterwards, or once they have the basic income. And I don't think that's quite as interesting, because the labor market is a market, and if you need people to work, you can pay them to work. Certainly a high enough basic income will disincentivize some level of work, but if you don't need people working, you can find out whether you need people working by giving everyone money to spend and see what jobs are needed to produce the stuff that people want to buy. And there's a balance there. You could certainly give people too much money, and then you'd get inflation or something like that. But I'd be interested to see more of the general macroeconomic effects from this program. Anyone have any thoughts before we move on to the next clip?
I agree with what you're saying, but I think that this point about freedom that people have to choose something else other than a job that is like, I think it is one of the things that, and the podcast talked about this. This is one of the things that people worry about. I think one of the sources of opposition is this idea that like, oh, but we need to have a bunch of people who are trapped doing jobs that nobody would want to do if they weren't trapped doing it.
Yeah.
And and one thing that the podcast made me think about was, it sounds like maybe it's true that Iran has more people whose lifestyle maybe relies on that than some other countries, right? Like if the elites, most of them have a lifestyle that relies on like having a cook and a driver and a kind of servant class, which is what I mean. I couldn't tell whether they were talking about like historically it was like that in Iran or if it's still like that now. Yeah.
It's an interesting question.
Then if it was true that a basic income set those people free to, and lots of them really did want to do something else and weren't able to do something else, then that would potentially produce more dislocation than in a different economy that had less of that, relied less, where fewer people relied on a whole bunch of people doing jobs that they really didn't want to do.
Yeah. So the question is, so I guess there's you can break this down into two parts. So the overall question is, how much does your economy depend on labor? And then part one of that is, how much does the stuff that ordinary, regular, poor people need depend on labor? And then the second part of that is, how much does the lifestyle of the rich and the conveniences of the rich depend on labor? So there's probably different answers to these different questions.
Even asking questions like who will pick up the garbages or who will be servants, they don't sound like ethical to me. Why those people have to do this kind of jobs just for being poor? Even Bill Gates, he admitted that being rich, I think half of it it's because of you are lucky. Not those poor people, they are not poor. Mostly they are not poor because of the reasons or something.
Yeah.
This is their, how can I say, destiny or something, I don't know. I'm talking about for most of them. Maybe some of them, okay, being lazy, laziness makes you poor sometimes, okay, but not, this is the case for all of them.
Yeah.
So asking this kind of questions sounds so selfish, too selfish. Like, who will pick up the garbage? We can automate it. Why we have to force people to do that?
Right. I mean, we either, or we can pay them a lot more, so they're not suffering as much, or they're not as poor. I would imagine that if people were able to say no to that kind of job, then you'd have to pay them more to get them to do it. And the rich people who are getting their garbage collected might not be happy with that. My mom pointed out that giving people the freedom not to do these jobs is akin to freeing the slaves. And I think that's a good analogy because you've got this situation. I mean, like, this is all hypothetical. We don't know that Iran works this way. But if you've got a situation where people are depending on really, really cheap or free labor, and then you're trying to help the people who are doing the labor, then that's going to be a loss for the people who are depending on that. It was a loss for the slave owners when we freed the slaves, and maybe that's okay. Maybe that's an okay sacrifice for a society to make. But certainly, the people who are in those positions, have an incentive to push back against that kind of a change. but I agree with you that that might be something to be frustrated about and not okay with. Yeah.
So selfish.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, even when we talk about, poor people and laziness, even if there are people out there who are poor because they're lazy or because they're, not doing kind of what society would expect of them ordinarily, I don't know that means necessarily that they should suffer. It only...
Even maybe they couldn't find their path to be,
Sure.
to find their passion.
Yeah, and I mean, can you really tell whether someone's lazy or not, like intrinsically? All you know is what they were able to accomplish in their life. I mean, there's no way to really tell, and I think, more important than that, if we have the resources to provide for people, then there's no reason not to. The only reason not to is if we have limited resources and we need to incentivize people to do certain things. Like you can imagine a society in which everything is really, really scarce, and if people aren't working, then it's really, really bad for everyone, and you need to create punishments for not working, or otherwise incentivize work beyond what you would get in like a labor market or something like that. And I don't, obviously here in America, that's not the world we live in, and in Iran, maybe because of sanctions and because of the state of their economy, maybe they have to accept, in order to function properly, they have to accept maybe a lower standard of living or something like that. But that doesn't mean zero. It doesn't mean we can't have some level of basic income. And they tried it. Yeah. My mom says she doesn't believe laziness is a thing. It's just a label. And there are complicated reasons. Well, I think
Makes sense.
I think laziness is a thing, and I think there are complicated reasons. But I wouldn't, there's a reason why we have labels. They mean something. Yeah, and do we want to, talk about lack of motivation as laziness, or something like that? And we kind of get into the semantics, but it's useful to be able to talk about these concepts, I would say. Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts before I move on to the next clip? Oh, here we go. This is related to what we're talking about, actually.
So you studied the effects of this program on labor supply. To start, what are the overall effects of this cash transfer program on people's employment?
Well, it's very hard to identify impact of this sort. The reason being that at the time, Iran was having other macroeconomic shocks. For example, about the same time, Iran was under sanctions, which is happening again. So an economic shock of that order that came as a result of sanctions in around 2011, that changes labor demand. So if you observe any changes in labor supply or employment rates, you don't know which shock had caused it, whether it was the cash transfer or something else that happened in the economy.
I think that was the end of that. Trying to multitask there. So yeah, there's a couple of points that are being made here. One is that he's primarily studying the effects on the labor supply, and I don't think that's the most interesting thing to study when it comes to a basic income. It is the thing that people are worried about the most, but it's not what I think is the most important aspect. There we go. So now we can see the quote as well. So I do think it's a good point that it's really hard to identify where various effects come from. If you've always got multiple things going on in your economy. So if you introduce something like a basic income, but then you also get sanctions against your country, now there's less stuff for people to buy. So if you get an effect like inflation, for example, how much of that is due to consumers having more money to spend, and how much is that due to consumers having less stuff to buy? So I think that's kind of a tricky thing to pull apart. I do think it's possible to adjust your basic income and adjust your monetary policy to keep prices where they need to be, or to keep price. My implicit assumption there is that prices need to stay stable over time, or mostly stable. So I think it is possible to keep prices stable, but it's not as easy to identify kind of like the underlying cause of why you have to push your monetary policy in one direction or another, that kind of thing. You can certainly tweak the basic income to have an effect, and you can, increase interest rates or something like that. I don't know much about Iran's central bank and their monetary policy. I know their currency is the rial, but this podcast doesn't really get into any of that stuff. And I would be curious to know what Iran's central bank is doing during these times when the cash transfers are introduced and when the sanctions come in and that kind of stuff. I think these are all really interesting questions.
I mean, it might, if in a situation like that where you have sanctions mean that suddenly a lot of things that people want that aren't made domestically are not available, then the prices are going to go up, right? I mean, there's a limit to how much the central bank could, what the central bank can do to address that, right?
Well, the prices aren't going to go up so presumably you have less of that thing available for people to buy.
Right.
So if you take money away from people until the amount of spending power they have matches up with the amount of stuff they can buy, then you can kind of keep prices stable that way. Yeah. But obviously,
but once you've taken all of somebody's money away.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
If you've taken all of someone's money away?
If you have to take almost all of somebody's money away.
Yeah.
Do that, then maybe that is worse. Maybe that's worse than having inflation.
Well, the amount of inflation you'd have would be roughly equivalent to, you'd be depreciating people's money roughly equivalently to how much, you'd be reducing their spending power by a roughly equivalent amount, either through inflation or through taking away their spending power directly by taking money away from them or taking income away from them. Yeah. In order to keep prices stable, it would have to be roughly equivalent. Except maybe with the effects of, there are other effects with inflation, like inefficiencies in pricing and that kind of thing. So you might be able to actually maintain a slightly higher spending power if you keep prices stable, I would think, because it's just more efficient to have a stable currency. Does that make sense? And this is also assuming that, and this is a big assumption that whether you go the inflation route or the taking money away from people's route, you're still going to have the same relative distribution of spending power in the economy, which isn't a guarantee. So you could imagine having a basic income going to everyone, and then the inflation is going to affect the people who have a lot more money more, and you can increase the basic income, and then it can be kind of like a redistributional system where you're taking spending power away from the rich and giving it to the poor and that kind of thing. So there's that as well. But these are the kinds of questions that I would really want someone to explore with this Iran system, because the question isn't, I said this before, but the question isn't whether people are going to work. We know that people are going to work to the extent that they have an incentive to work. And certainly to the extent that we need their labor, we're not going to give people so much money that there's not enough labor in the economy, because that would be inflation too. Yeah. But yeah, all these I think this is kind of similar to when we talked about Venezuela, in that maybe not as extreme, but you had a country with sanctions against it that had to figure out how to stabilize their economy, and with what little resources they had, how to be efficient with those resources, and that kind of thing.
I actually sent you an article today about how Russia is going to help Venezuela, and they want to introduce a basic income. They want to introduce a new currency, like the sovereign, whatever it was. They want to get rid of that and have another one, and they want to invest money into Venezuela to increase exports.
Huh.
And so that's this three-pronged approach they want to do.
So Russia wants to introduce a basic income in Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
Do they want to introduce a basic income in Russia?
I don't know.
Because that's interesting. It's interesting that I wonder what their rationale would be for paying for a basic income in someone else's country. I'd have to look at that article. That's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's see. Any thoughts before I move on to the next one? I think I'm going to skip this one about comparing labor supply between 2 years. No, we can play it.
So what we did was to look at a panel data in which people were observed in 2010 before they received cash and 2011. And we made a comparison of the labor supply between the 2 years.
So yeah, I mean, I think these are the kinds of comparisons you can make. And again, I would emphasize that I don't care about the labor supply, and I want to see similar comparisons about the output of the economy and other macroeconomic factors, inflation, that kind of thing. Because it's not a given that if you reduce oil subsidies and spend the same amount of money you're spending in the oil subsidies, but hand it out to people, it's not a given that wouldn't cause inflation, because you're changing where the money is in the economy. You're introducing money that wasn't there before, you're giving spending power to people who didn't have it before, and they're buying things that they weren't able to buy before. Before it only applied to oil. I'd be interested in seeing this kind of stuff, and then I'd also and this information is probably out there, but I'd be interested in learning what kind of price index Iran uses for inflation. What kind of goods do they put in their market basket? Because if you've got oil in there, and the price of oil changes, then that's immediate inflation if your oil skyrockets. But what are the best basket of goods is the one that reflects the lived experience of the people in your economy. So if people are going around, living their lives buying oil all the time, then that's a price that's really, but they're not eating oil, so maybe food is a more important price, food and housing and that kind of thing. So I'd just be curious to know how they measure inflation in Iran and see kind of the effects of these changes. Yeah. I see you turning away over there, Nick.
The guy who did the study would probably be a good person to ask.
Yeah, that's a good point. Might be good to email him and see what he thinks about this stuff. Yeah, and I mean, I think politically he is asking the right question. Like, that is what people are worried about, and in terms of getting it to be popular, if you can definitively show that people keep working, then he's probably doing the right thing. Yeah. So this one.
And we also had an idea of whose income had received the bigger shock, because we observe people's incomes, and if you're poor and you receive $45 per month per person, then you get a much bigger income shock. Like if you're poor, maybe that is your income level. So your income goes up by 100%. We have people in the survey whose income doubled. And then you have very rich people whose income barely changes as a result. We took advantage of this variation in the what we call intensity of the shock to see if labor supply had changed or had changed differently for poor and rich, and we could not observe anything.
So this is a really interesting point about, and this is a point I bring up a lot, about the effect of the income being different for the poor and the rich. So if you are giving, a small amount of basic income to a rich person, it's not going to change kind of their behavior in the economy, what they buy, how much money they spend, that kind of thing. So there's no way it can really cause inflationary pressure or something like that. So it's, I've made this point before, but if you reduce the amount of money that you're giving to the rich, that doesn't actually allow you to give more money to the poor, because when you give money to the poor, that money is actually going to purchase real production and use up real resources. So I thought it was interesting that he made this point about just like the effect is different depending on where it goes. And I think a lot of people forget that, and they think, okay, well, if you balance a budget, or if you tax to be able to pay for it, then the taxes somehow make it possible to spend that money. And it depends. It depends where you're taking the money from and where you're putting it, and whether taking money from a part of the economy over here ended up freeing up resources in a part of the economy over here. And if you can't make that connection, then it doesn't really add up. Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts about that one? So my mom said maybe people would buy much less in order to stay out of the labor force. Jobs make you buy stuff you don't need to. Well, certainly, like we can all imagine, needing to buy a car so you can commute to your job, or just needing to buy gas every day to pay for that commute. I guess that's the example I always bring up. But there's all kinds of things that you would buy in order to be able to do your job, or that your company would buy for you in order to be able to do your job. Your computers and office furniture and all of that stuff. Uniforms, yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that goes into keeping people employed. And if that employment is not producing more stuff than it's using up, then that's a problem. So if people are receiving a basic income and that's causing us to commit fewer resources to keeping people employed, then that can actually increase the amount of stuff that people can buy.
Free up capacity.
Would free up capacity, yeah. Oh, okay. So am I correct in saying you're also talking about people have the money and because they have the job, and then that just incentivizes to buy stuff they don't need? Is that what you're talking about? I think that's what she's saying. So yeah, there's some of that too. I don't think that would change if you're getting your money from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
They would still buy that
Yeah.
for no reason.
Right. If you just have money coming in, and it's roughly the same amount of money, you might buy roughly the same amount of stuff. Now there could be maybe people are really depressed at their jobs and they buy stuff to compensate for that, and they wouldn't have to do that if they didn't have this miserable job. But I don't think that's. I guess I would lump that in with the things that you have to buy in order to support the labor market. I think that probably falls into that category. Shopping therapy, yeah. You wouldn't need shopping therapy if you didn't have a job that you needed to feel better from. I think that's right.
Something came off my mind.
Yeah.
Maybe by not working on the office in the offices.
Yeah.
They wouldn't eat out. I mean, they will be at home. They will prepare their food themselves, and maybe this will affect in a good way their health.
Yeah.
Because when people work, as we know, generally they tend to eat unhealthy foods, fast foods.
A lot of people don't have the time to make good food for themselves, and if they are looking for convenient food, they don't have the money to buy something that's healthier than McDonald's, that kind of thing. So that could be a big factor too. Yeah. So my mom said you might be. So part of the point she's trying to make, she says you might be able to live on basic income and not work at all, just have to cut back. So I think that comes with the assumption that the amount of the basic income is somehow going to be less, and I don't think that's necessarily the case. The idea, at least when I think about basic income, is that the economy has a certain capacity to produce stuff for people sustainably, and then the question is, how do you activate that capacity? So as long as you're doing that properly, it's not that people would necessarily be buying less in aggregate. They might even be buying more, as long as it's what we could sustainably produce. So I think a lot of people, when they think about basic income, they think about it as like a certain minimum level of income that's designed to just meet people's basic needs or something like that. Whereas I would not limit it to that. Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts before I move on to the next clip? We're making good progress here. Trick is to have a smaller group. There we go.
This program was, in essence, a very good program because it was redirecting a very bad and distorting subsidy, energy subsidies, to cash transfer. So it was very hard to disagree with it, unlike UBI, where people are objecting to the financing part of the program. It was very hard to object to the financing part of the Ahmadinejad program.
Yeah, you guys might notice that I'm not able to spell Ahmadinejad. I might have several different spellings in here. This file was not for public consumption initially. So this is interesting because he's making a distinction between the Iran cash transfers and the basic income, even though I would say that it's very similar to a basic income. But I think what's happening here is that he's imagining that basic income inherently, as part of it, has taxes built in. That's part of what basic income is. And I know when we talk about it here, we don't necessarily include that. So when he says unlike UBI, I would say unlike a tax-funded UBI or UBI with a tax attached to it. So instead of a UBI with a tax attached to it, you have a UBI with a subsidy cut attached to it. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, they talk about this in India. Well, there's actually a plan to, by 2022, to introduce a basic income in, I think it's called Sikkim province or something like that, and they want to get rid of farm waivers, farm loan waivers, which I was reading that would have banks less likely to loan to the poor because they would have the loan waived, and energy subsidies like in Iran.
Okay, so it would be a way to
get money to the poor without distorting the economy.
Right, and without them having to borrow, and a lot of times not being able to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting how everybody who talks about basic income or all the programs that attempt to implement something similar are trying to match up some kind of funding source to it, and it's an interesting story. But like even they were admitting here, when you're adding money to a part of the economy that didn't have it before, like poor consumers, then that's a different effect than adding it to a rich part of the economy. And by the same token, taking it away from the rich part of the economy isn't going to balance it out. Or taking money from one part of the economy, it doesn't. What makes the basic income possible isn't that you got money from somewhere. It's that there's stuff for people to buy, or potentially stuff for people to buy. Now, in terms of the popularity of the Iran program, or I guess it wasn't that popular, but the justifiability of it, he's arguing that it was something they were getting anyway, or something that we're paying for anyway, and now it's going to be more fairly allocated to the people. And that's more of a moral argument than an economic one. And moral arguments are fine as long as they are consistent with economics that work. So you can hear people saying like such and such should be such and such a way, like CEOs shouldn't make more than there should be a ceiling on how much they should make, or whatever. And there's all kinds of moral arguments like that. But when we hear these, we have to ask: is it compatible with the economics? Is it compatible with something that would actually work and be better for people? So the fact that they reduced the oil subsidies, I don't know that that's what made it possible. I don't know that that's what made the basic income possible. And if the reduction of the oil subsidies caused an increase in oil prices, then and that spilled over into other prices in the economy, then maybe that reduces the amount of basic income you can afford, because now certain resources are more expensive when maybe they had the ability to provide more oil for everyone. So I don't know that, this is just hypothetical. I don't know that they could have done that, but you could imagine a world in which you can afford more basic income if you're also subsidizing oil. Like that's a possibility, depending on what your constraints are in your oil production and that kind of thing. This is a moral argument, and it's not really an economics argument.
That really stood out to me, that he was saying, as opposed to a basic income, this program,
right,
such and such, and he was saying that this wasn't a basic income because of its connection with these oil subsidies.
Yeah,
it just seemed confused to me. But I guess it's sort of telling. Yeah, it illustrates how strongly people identify the idea of a basic income with certain assumed mechanisms for funding it.
Yeah.
I had another way to tell the story, kind of inspired by our discussion last week. I wonder if it fits the facts just as well to say they wanted to reduce the subsidies because it was producing bad distortions in their economy, and they were worried about the kind of fallout similar to what's going on in France, and this was their strategy for mitigating it. I guess he did sort of when he told it, he did tell it that way at one point.
Yeah.
That's different from saying, now we have this money, that's what we decided to do with it.
Right. He talked about preventing unrest and that kind of thing. And I don't really know what those distortions were. Certainly, I think if oil is more expensive, if petroleum is more expensive, then that creates an incentive for people not to use it as much, and that's good for the environment, pretty much universally.
Leaves more left over for export.
Leaves more left over for export.
They said in the podcast that most of the oil that Iran produces goes to the domestic use.
Right.
So if they free up more for export, that means they get more money into the economy. And back in the beginning of the program, there was more. The prices of oil. The price of oil was much higher than it was in 2016.
I see. So I mean that raises some questions. I guess. So who are they exporting oil to? Are there sanctions on Iran's oil exports? I feel. Yeah. So I feel like maybe there have been at some point. So then there's a question of how much oil could they really export if they wanted to.
But there was an easing with it with the with Obama's Iran
With the nuclear deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then, well, Trump went out against that, but that was after this ended.
Interesting.
But maybe they're planning for the future. Maybe they're sort of projecting that these sanctions aren't going to last forever. We want to have more oil left over. I mean,
yeah. I mean, I'd have to know more about. Is there like a fixed amount of oil that they're producing in any given year, and they're just deciding how much of it goes to their own country and how much of it is being exported, or could they be, producing more oil? These are all relevant questions. And then another question is, if they do export oil and bring foreign money into the economy, what are they going to be able to buy with that foreign money? Presumably there are sanctions on imports from other countries too. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what they're going to be able to buy. Yeah, I'd like to know more about what kind of distortions they were worried about when they ended the subsidies. I know I mentioned the possible, people arbitraging in black markets and stuff like that, getting cheap oil in Iran and then selling it and that kind of thing. But maybe it's more than that.
They talked about in the podcast how the rich were able to use more of the oil because they actually had cars and things, and they had larger homes to heat to use natural gas or whatever to heat.
So you think those are partly the distortions he's talking about?
Mm-hmm. So they can afford more oil and they can have higher temperatures in their house, or they can travel farther or something.
I see. So it created an incentive for people to waste energy in the domestic economy, and potentially increase carbon emissions just because all of this was so cheap. And that wasn't really benefiting anybody but the people who were richer and had cars and bigger houses and stuff like that anyway. I think that makes sense. I think it makes sense that they would want to curb that. Yeah.
I'm reading a news thing saying about the recent reimposition of sanctions from the U.S. side is that a lot of other countries like Russia, France, Germany, UK are saying
they have their own separate agreement.
Yeah, they're saying like, no, we're still going to buy that oil.
Okay. And once they buy the oil, what is Iran going to be able to buy with the money that they get sent? Is the question as well. Because it's one thing.
The biggest customer is China.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because it's one thing to get a lot of money, but if you're selling something that's actually useful, like oil, and then you're getting back money that's really hard for you to spend, then you're not necessarily winning in that deal, even if it's a lot of money. Yeah. But maybe, they could be anticipating a future with fewer sanctions, like you were saying.
They probably buy anything that they want from China.
If they could buy anything that they wanted from China, then sanctions would have no effect. Maybe the sanctions do have no effect. I don't know.
I'm saying that of things that are available from China, they could buy those.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like in House of Cards, they had, during this one segment with nuclear power, they needed this rare earth element, and so they had India buy it for them, and then they paid India, and so they circumvented China's sanctions on the U.S. For not trading them. So I think it was like cesium or something.
Yeah.
It could be something like that.
I think that's right. I think if you're willing to pay the price, there's always ways to get stuff. It can just get harder if there's sanctions and other inefficiencies in the way. So I think it's less of a complete shutting down and more of making everything. The ultimate effect is that you're making everything more expensive through the sanctions. Yeah. So I think Richard, I think you're right that it's a distorting subsidy, largely because it causes people to waste energy. I think that's right. So, and then maybe your economy could have afforded a basic income before, and now you have a moral argument for why you're able to do it. That we were paying for the oil discounts, and now we're paying for something else. Not just a moral argument, but an accounting argument. You're balancing your budget, that kind of thing. Yeah. So let's go to the next one. Or does anyone have any thoughts before we go to the next one?
So most of the criticism that came from the middle class, upper middle class, kind of new liberal economists was that this money was going to make people lazy and not work. So we were looking at labor supply in a very at a very time when the dominant opinion expressed in Iranian business journals, other newspapers, partly because most of them hated Ahmadinejad, the liberal media in Iran, for good reason, did not like Ahmadinejad. But they also didn't like this program as a result.
Didn't like this program as a result. Yeah, so this speaks to the politics of it a little bit. So upper middle class economists, business journals were all critical of this program because they thought it was going to make people lazy and not work. So I don't know if I have anything else to say on this that I haven't already said. But you could imagine a high enough basic income would actually incentivize people to work less or not work. And if you have too many people working in your economy, if you have too much labor in your economy, and your basic income isn't causing people to work less, then maybe your basic income isn't high enough. So I don't know, this fear of people being lazy, this fear of people not working, it's something that basic income, as it's usually discussed, has in common with the Iran program. How do we change the narrative? How do we get people not to worry about this? I mean, there are a lot of people working on showing that, it doesn't actually cause people not to work, but how do we get people not to worry about whether people are not going to work?
Yeah, I think it's the biggest challenge, and I don't know, other than miracle.
It is not human nature.
Not human nature?
Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody should do something. They cannot be just wandering around. I mean, they don't like it actually.
Yeah.
I have an idea.
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Well, you can have a factory and see how compare the production before you have like 10,000 people working in the factory, and then compare it to how you automate it and have only 1,000 people working there or something, and see we don't need 9,000 people, and we can how produce the same amount, and so you can see we could give 9,000 people a basic income, and we can still produce the same amount of stuff.
I like that line of thinking in terms of just saying, hey, we're producing X amount of stuff, and now we're able to produce X amount of stuff using less labor, but the same amount of stuff is being produced, so it should be possible for people to be able to buy that stuff. we can make the stuff, therefore, it makes sense that we should be able to give the money to buy it. That just kind of adds up in that way. In terms of looking at a specific factory and trying to set it up to automate, I don't know, it might be more useful to look at factories that have automated instead of trying to ask a factory that hadn't automated before to start automating, because presumably they haven't automated yet, at least partly because labor is cheap enough that it's not worth it for them to automate at this point. But you can look at
like with Amazon's distribution centers.
Yeah.
This past winter or whatever, they actually didn't hire fewer workers to package their stuff. So that shows that they're more productive, and they don't need. It's the first time ever that they've hired fewer people.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. And I think there are examples like that we can point to. And the question is, can we translate that into, saying that morally we shouldn't, be expecting people to work? I feel like the economics makes sense and the logic makes sense. And obviously, at the level of the overall economy, we see this effect in aggregate that we're able to produce more and more using less and less labor. I don't know. I think it's still a tricky one. I think I think it might be the case that people aren't really going to see this until we have something like a basic income in place, or maybe start small and then people gradually see more, or something like that. But I think people have to seeing is believing and actually experiencing it themselves, or living in a world where the expectations of you but from the government are a little bit different, and then that can kind of push the expectations of society or influence the expectations of other people, what they expect from you.
Even the people who lived thousands years ago, they were producing, they were farming, for example. They were also productive.
Yeah.
People cannot. People want to be productive.
I think that's right.
I think there is nobody who doesn't want to be productive. Everybody has a passion about something.
Yeah, I think most people are excited about something and having some kind of objective that they're excited to work towards.
Unless they are sick or something else.
Right. But those kinds of passions do not necessarily always align with what society expects from them in the economy. So maybe someone's passion is to be really good at a video game or a sport, or there's some hobby like sailing or something that they really are putting everything into, and I think that's human nature. And it's possible to provide people with that kind of opportunity without necessarily making up jobs for them to do. And I think there's an overlap between jobs that are meaningful to the worker and jobs that are contributing to the overall economy, but I don't think that's a 100% overlap. So yeah, I think everything you're saying is right, that people do need to have this sense of meaning and purpose. I recently, this week I wrote a blog post kind of about human purpose based on our meetup that we had earlier in the year, or last year. But yeah, it's an interesting question. How do you ensure that everyone has kind of meaning and purpose and fulfillment in their lives? And then another question is, how do you ensure that we're using our resources for the benefit of everyone, and that includes labor. And the answer to these questions are not necessarily the same answer. So you might have to have kind of two different approaches. How do you get the labor that you need, and how do you get the fulfillment that people need? So we got some comments here on the live stream. So Alex Lancaster says, David Draper makes the point a lot in his work that the average peasant didn't really work the way we work, something like the equivalent of 100 days a year. So that's interesting. Obviously, they had less in their lives, but
there were also tons of holidays back then.
Yeah.
That people adhered to, like religious holidays and things. And
probably
so
not during harvest season, though, right?
I don't.
I mean, if the weather is such that you need to harvest your crops today, then I don't think a holiday is going to get in the way of that. But yeah, I would imagine that it wasn't. And also, it's hard, like for farmers, what does it mean to have a holiday? I guess that just that you celebrate and go to festivals and that kind of thing.
And feasts and whatnot.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, like clearly the fact that that they were working less and presumably feeling like they were contributing their part and being fulfilled in that way in their lives. I don't know how happy they were, but probably. If it was what was normal and what was expected, they probably were living their lives as people do. That suggests to me that it's not human nature to necessarily overwork yourself for some purpose that's not directly inspiring to you, that kind of thing.
There's actually a condition in Japan called karaishi or something like that, where people work themselves to death, and it's really common for salary workers.
And so that sounds like it's a cultural thing, because we don't have that here. But
there was an intern a few years ago in a financial firm in New York, it was like Citigroup or something like that worked themselves to death.
Wow. Yeah, so a question we could ask is, a lot of this stuff that seems like human nature, it could be human nature in a certain context, but then how much of it is cultural and how much of it is biological? And our culture has changed a lot in the past few hundred years, and our biology has not. We did not evolve in a world with factories and wage labor and that kind of stuff. But yet our culture is very much, the culture of that is very much ingrained in who we are. But the fact that it's not biological suggests to me that it's something we can change. And the fact that it's different in different countries suggests to me that it's something we can change.
I think in this conversation, something that I feel like I'm not sure exactly how to lay it out, but that's sort of missing is the idea of exploitation. And if you think, I really liked Jones sort of putting the emancipation of the slaves as a kind of more extreme version of the same thing. I think some of, and Alex is sort of saying that the
oh no, I wasn't recording. So forget what I said about everything being recorded. Now it's recording.
Oh.
Stream status bad.
Stream status bad. I don't know why that is.
Hours live in 13 minutes 22 seconds.
Not moving.
How much were we actually recording?
How much were we actually recording?
Uh-huh.
I just started it just now. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. What happens if I click that? Nothing.
Only an hour and 14 minutes is actually recorded.
So that's how long we've been streaming live.
Yeah, that's how long we've been streaming. That's fine.
We usually have an hour. Right now we should have an hour and 35 minutes.
Well, we got 20 minutes left, so that would...
So
yeah, what happened?
I know. We should have an hour and 55 minutes at the end of this.
Yeah, you're right. Well, I don't know, you guys. I don't know how to fix this.
no idea.
What happens if we refresh? It just says they're not receiving video data at a fast enough rate.
Oh, now it's about the amount of time we should have.
Oh, well, that's good, I guess. All right. Well, we're still here on the chat. I don't know why the video stream. Okay. So I'll just say that, and we can just talk. Oh well. I guess that's what they get for not showing up in person. Yeah. So let's. This one we've already kind of talked about as well. Wait a minute. Oh no, this is the one we want. Yeah.
It might have. Unfortunately, the Rouhani government that succeeded Ahmadinejad kept bad-mouthing this program. They use this unfortunate language of fostering beggars. I've talked to a lot of poor people in Iran who receive cash transfer. They take that very personal. They are not stupid. They understand the source of this money is Iran's natural wealth.
So I thought that was funny, because the source, what makes the money possible is not. I guess in a way it is Iran's natural wealth, but not in the way they're thinking about it. It's not necessarily the oil. But yeah, I mean, like, so much of this is political, and the fact that I actually don't understand this, and this is related to something Nick, you were saying before, which was that the Rouhani government at the same time were saying that it was fostering beggars, but also increasing the payments to the poor. So I wonder if they added more like work requirements or something else at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this does seem like in our polarized political environment, if you imagine one administration putting it in place, it's almost guaranteed that the other party would try to use it as, or it seems likely, just as a political club.
Yeah.
To beat them with, and that the fact that we do have this cultural, there's this idea that enabling idleness is bad, or people are going to exploit it.
That's just like with Ford in Ontario, or Ottawa. I don't know. Ontario.
Yeah.
Canceling the basic income program. It's like that.
Was he making the same kind of arguments?
Mm-hmm. Everyone should have a job.
Yeah.
Maybe what it means is that it's really important that if it's going to stick, like it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to make it stick if it's one party imposing it against the objections of another. Better to wait to really broad consensus.
So here's a question, which is what made Social Security stick? Because there was a ton of controversy at the time when it was enacted, and a lot of people were against it. And now taking it away is like nobody wants that.
Right.
Yeah.
Discussed. Yeah. That's a good question.
It's because, the elderly are a powerful voting bloc, so no one wants to anger them. It's the third rail, like it said in the West Wing.
Right.
Yeah, or Obamacare. Right. I mean, the Republicans got the power with the part of their platform to get rid of it, but once they got it.
But there's a judge just like a few weeks, like last week I think it was, that wants to get the
Right. The fight's not totally over, but they had chances to. Like they couldn't get it through the Senate. The Republicans couldn't get a repeal of Obamacare through the.
But a federal judge went against it.
Right. I mean, yeah, it might still die. But
Do you think
But it's because
Obama?
it's so popular, right? Like once people get a benefit,
Right.
it becomes really popular.
Now, the thing with Obamacare is that a lot of the people with money aren't really getting the benefit. Right. I think the benefit.
Protection against pre-existing conditions.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know. So, do you think Obamacare could be the new Social Security in terms of it being untouchable?
I think a bunch of elements of it are.
Yeah. Okay.
I think 2020 is going to have a big issue with single payer. It's
Yeah.
going to be a major topic.
Okay. So just even going further and I guess removing some of the inefficiencies that are there, and yeah. Huh. Yeah, part of me wonders with Social Security if part of the reason why it's so popular is because you kind of get it as a reward for working your whole life. So it's still kind of like the labor thing is still part of it.
No, but there's this whole weird credit system. You have to work so much and have to pay in so much money, and
Right.
otherwise you only get like $500 or some stupid thing.
Right.
But yeah, on the other hand, maybe it's because it has something that it shares with UBI. It's pretty universal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, there's this argument that UBI that the universal part is important for maintaining support because otherwise
it can look, people can frame it as something that other people get that they don't deserve.
right.
Yeah. I think that's right. So a question I have about the Iran plan is, do we think that it would have met with as much resistance if they hadn't seen inflation during that time period? Because the amount of benefit was a lot higher at the beginning, and then it kept creeping down as inflation increased.
Right, and I guess that could have two effects, right? One is that people are blaming the inflation on this program.
Yeah.
They could resent the program. Then the other is that the benefit to themselves they see from it is declining.
Yeah.
I think it's because of the subsidies, like you said earlier, and causing there to be less amount and so to choose from, and there's all this pent up demand, and that pushes up the amount of inflation.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So another question we might ask is, would it maybe have been less unpopular if they hadn't tied it to the cuts in the oil subsidies? Like maybe they needed to cut the oil subsidies, for all of these, distortionary reasons. But if the basic income had come in and it wasn't kind of politically tied to that, would it have potentially been less unpopular?
Did the new administration reinstate those subsidies?
I'm not sure.
I guess I didn't hear anybody say that they did.
Yeah, I don't know that they did. I think they're under more sanctions. Well, actually, I don't know. I think they're under more sanctions now after the nuclear deal is kind of. I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question. In which case, what would have made it justifiable to cut the benefits to the richer people and give more benefits to the poorer people, without fostering beggars? Like if Rouhani is saying you're fostering beggars, then there's got to be more to it than just giving more to the poor. There's got to be some kind of work requirement or something like that.
Maybe
Some
it's
kind of restriction.
like some sort of like a World Bank or something like that, some sort of international organization that's pressuring them so that they can release some of the sanctions or something.
Maybe. I don't know. That's interesting. I'd like to know more about the politics of this. I feel like, I mean, it would make sense if the Rouhani government was more on the left and wanting to help the poor and wanting to, you know, not give as much money to the rich and, you know, was kind of more progressive in that way. It would make sense as a policy to make this change. But it doesn't make sense that they were talking about fostering beggars, if that's the case. But I don't know. Interesting questions.
Political rhetoric's not always consistent, though.
Yeah, that's true. So here we got another clip. Oh, no, we don't need that one. We've already talked about the feudal lords. This one I don't have the whole text for because I was running out of time.
The other thing that I think is very important to understand for Iran is that universality of this payment has not been given enough credit. What Rouhani has done, he has actually tripled the amount of money that the poor get, but he has tried very hard to cut off people from the upper scales, the upper deciles of income from this program. And that's very unfortunate because I believe that a lot of the negative results we observe for various income assistance programs is because they have what economists call a cliff effect. That is when a person gets close to this threshold of income, after which they do not qualify for assistance, they may stop work. And universality does away with that threshold, does away with that cliff. And what they have done in Iran is they've gone back from a universal program to a conditional program, a means-tested program, which I think is going to exacerbate the poverty problem in Iran.
Yeah. So I think the universality is important. I think he's talking. I think it's important for more than just the cliff. I think the cliff problem can kind of be avoided if you gradually phase it out as people get more and more income. Maybe the benefits, you know, gradually decrease. There's no cliff there anymore. But I think the universality is important for the simplicity of administration. You don't have to figure out who's poor and who's not and who's rich, et cetera, et cetera. And then for just the feeling that it's not something that only those people get or something like that. The inclusivity of the universality, I think, is super important. Yeah. Do one more clip.
The final one.
The final one. Yeah.
One thing I would like to add, which is Iran has a poverty issue. There's like 10 million people who are classified as poor by international standard. And when this program was first instituted, because inflation hadn't started yet, and the magnitude about $1.50 per person per day was quite significant, contribution to people's income poverty fell significantly. We estimated that in rural areas, poverty came from 13% to around 4%, which is very significant. And now, because inflation has been very, very high, and again, it picked up this year because of the arrival of new sanctions. The amount of this cash transfer has become very little, maybe 1/4, 1/5 of what it used to be. So,
yeah. I think we talked about this, that the amount, in terms of the actual purchasing power it's providing people, it's a lot less than before. So does that mean that the amount of basic income that Iran can sustain is less than it was before because of all these sanctions and people just can't buy as much stuff? I don't know. Does anyone have any final thoughts about Iran? All right, Nick.
More. I want to know more.
You want to know more? I want to know more too. And I think this is really what to look at. And like I was saying before, you know, the fact that this was such a large scale, it was a whole country. I'd really like to learn more about the macroeconomic effects and and everything about it. Yeah, go ahead,
Well,
Richard.
maybe they could have like put all their extra money for the into like a sovereign wealth fund or like a permanent wealth fund like in Alaska, and then paid out the dividends or whatever, the basic income to the people with that, and funded it that way.
Yeah, it's unclear to me. I actually don't know how they structure their finances. I don't know if they, presumably they aren't setting it up like that now. I don't know. I think ultimately in the end it's a matter of how much spending, how much consumer spending can the economy afford to absorb?
But
What
then,
capacity is there?
if they did send out like a sovereign wealth fund, how much exposure to like foreign financial markets do they even have to invest in?
Yeah, I don't know. I do know they have their own stock market, and I don't know much beyond that. Presumably they have access to, or some access to China. I know China has a lot of barriers in terms of who can access their financial markets and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, these are interesting questions. I think
If I didn't misunderstood, in the podcast, it said 500,000 people quit farming.
500,000 people quit farming?
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe this is the only bad thing.
Is it a bad thing? Did we need all those people farming, or now maybe there can be more specialization and they can buy their food from the people who are still farming? I don't know. It's hard to say whether that's a bad thing or not.
And it also said self-employment increased. I mean,
Self-employment,
they made more.
more entrepreneurship, that kind of thing.
No. Self-employees work more because they spend more money. People spend more money. I think that's why.
They
Yeah.
invested the money. They invested the extra money in their businesses.
Yeah.
Right.
I think this also provide the
Yeah.
freedom. People had a chance to make the.
Yeah, and they have more people to sell to too, because everyone else has the basic income as well. So now you've got every business that's out there, whether you're self-employed or a bigger business. Now you've got more potential customers. So I think this is the point that people like Andrew Yang try to make with basic income creating jobs, because now there are more customers everywhere. Yeah.
And one more thing, he says, it makes more powerful women.
Right. So the women have more freedom to, if they're financially dependent, they're not as financially dependent on, husbands and that kind of thing.
Yeah, they were able to build their own small business at home.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think it was a glorious golden age in the history of Iran, and hopefully we'll see more stuff like this again in, maybe other places. And I'd certainly like to see more analysis of what they did in Iran. So thanks for coming out, guys. Thanks to everyone who kind of weathered the whatever happened on the live stream. If you're still there. If not, you can watch me thanking you later. Next week, we're talking about racism. So that's going to be an interesting discussion. So we're reading a Ta-Nehisi Coates article, The Case for Reparations, which was a pretty famous article from a few years ago. And we're going to talk about how much of that stuff makes sense when basic income is in the discussion. So see everyone next week.